Welcome everybody to the Blazor example. This is going to be your end result. Fairly simple. However, the background code will actually be very flexible for you. So you will learn everything you need to know in order to understand routing in Blazor and how to leverage it to your advantage. In this case, we will have something like this. So if we submit this string as code, we will have two values coming in, 0 and the test. And we'll have many different scenarios of passing in the values in different URLs, in the links, and whatnot, and show you the actual flexibility Blazor has when it comes to routing and how it's far better than Razor. So check it out. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to see you once more on my Blazor Basics tutorial. And today we're going to be discussing routing. I use the word paging interchangeably with routing, so if you ever hear that going on, just know that I mean the same thing. Anyways, routing is how we navigate between pages on an application or website or blah blah blah. Angular, React, Blazor, you know the gist, works in very similar fashions, and the only thing you really need to understand is how to implement these things in the Blazor language. And that's what we're going to do now. That's what you're going to be learning, and that is the tutorial for today. So there's really nothing much more for me to explain to you other than the fact that it's just how you move between page to page. So there's no fun bits coming out here and there, and we're just going to get started right now. Welcome back to the project, ladies and gentlemen. If you have been following me since the other two tutorials, then I thank you. You've been supporting me and I love you. And if you have not, don't worry. This project does not need anything from the other two chapters that you missed. This is going to be brand new stuff on brand new pages. So you are up to speed, basically. Only go back to the other chapters if you have something to refresh on. And if you do not have an intro project, please go to my video and find out how to make one. If not, just understand it's just the Microsoft intro product. There's nothing really complicated going on, and there's not really any setup for you. Anyways, on this particular project, we're going to learn how to do routing. And the first thing we're going to do is add new tabs to our application here. So what you got to do is go to the nav menu.razor, and we're going to copy paste this fetch data list HTML with the nav link component twice. So what this is gonna do is it's gonna add two more tabs to the application. So the first tab, we're gonna call it route example, and then we're gonna change the href to the same name except all together in lowercase. And the last one, we're gonna call it test, and we're gonna call it test as well, all lowercase. So if you were to run this right now, these will have no pages associated with it. We have not created it just yet, but we're gonna do it now. So we're gonna go to the pages and add a Razor component here. You don't need to add the other Razor page. The Razor component will do just fine. It's just you're gonna need to do one extra step here in order to make this work like pages. So we're gonna call it route example, and make sure that these are capital case, because if not, it's not gonna work. That's the Blazor convention. So add it. So we have a route example here, just the header of name, and then we're gonna add one for the test as well, test component. Go. So now we have our test, we have our route example. So now we have our components. However, if you try to run them, I'm going to run this now and skip to when I load. If I try to go to the route example or the test, I'm going to say there's nothing here. This is done by Blazor by default, that if it can't reach a page, it'll just give you this message. But that is because we have not added the route attributes for this to be a proper page. In order to do that, you have to go up to the top of the page, an at page quotation slash, and then the name of the URL you're going to use. You can't use one that's already being used. This is being used by the index page, so you can't use that one, so you have to give it a name. So we'll call it route example. Now I peeked into the future and I saw that this is spelled incorrectly in nav menu. So would you please go to navmenu.razor and change it to route example. This will help my OCD, please. So if we run it like this will all work just fine, and we're gonna just take the time to do it for test as well. So if you have this and you run it, again, I'm going to skip it. You will see that the elements that are there, the H3 elements, are showing up because now we're actually hitting the route. So I don't know if you can see this, but it says route example here. It says test here. That means that our routing works. That is the super basic definition of paging. And if that's all you want to know, I mean routing, and that's all you want to know, then you're good to go. However, this is not enough to run a proper project or web application of any sort, because normally you're gonna need to pass in parameters. And in my honest opinion, the three parameters that you're usually passing are IDs, bools, and strings. So we're gonna have an example of that. And we're gonna have a few examples of how to pass in both in code and directly on the HTML. So now things get a little bit complicated. You're just gonna have to trust me in a few things. So now we're gonna go on our /test. So what this project is gonna look like is that we're gonna have just a bunch of buttons on this test folder that every time we click on them, we will submit to the route example file. And then when that happens, the route example file will show you the values that you're passing through, showing you that what you've written actually works. So that is all the example is. So before we start adding stuff to the test page is always going to be just a bunch of buttons that are going to pass in values to route example page. We're going to have to discuss paging a little bit more. So let's go look at this. So up here, how Blazor works is that you can have unique and multiple URLs that can hit this page. So if I wanted to, I could call it app page. Instead of calling it route example, I could call it paging or /paging. I know I spelled it wrong, but it doesn't matter. It just has to be unique, and this will be allowed in Blazor. You can have multiple of these and it's all good, but we're not gonna add it. What we're gonna add is parameters to it. Now, how do you add parameters in Blazor? You have to make sure that the URL actually supports those parameters. So Blazor has a list of different variable types it can pass through, but we're just gonna focus on 3 in this tutorial, and that is the integer, the bool, and the string. These are usually the ones that are the most prevalent and the most used. So I'm just gonna set up an easy example. You could even do this route example, except we're gonna add a parameter to it. Get your curlies on, my optional bool, and give it a type. So you have to add a colon, you have to add the type at the end of it to make it work. It doesn't work for all types. It works, there's a list of what it works for. And we're just gonna keep adding them onto this page. So when we go on the test page, we don't have to worry about whether it's gonna hit it or not, because we know we're supporting it. So you could do it like this, or you can just copy this again. Down here, we can add 2 variables. So instead of just my optional bool, we could add an integer. We'll just call it ID of int. And then we could add one more, which is going to represent the string. Down a little bit. Instead of my optional parameter, how you write a string in Blazor. You don't need to actually have the type. So we're just going to call it my optional value. And add, oh, I forgot to mention that if they're truly optional, aka that that you don't have to add them to the URL, you have to add the question mark to them. So this, in this case, this is not an optional value, but since I'm going to be using the same variable, I'm going to be one that's it's looking for. It's going to be necessary to invoke this page if you're passing a Boolean in this way. If you're not, then you will only need to pass an ID of integer in order to hit this page. And if you have a Boolean or a string come after it, you can still hit the page all the same. If you didn't have these prepared, it would not allow you to do it. So if I did not have this and I passed in a value of integer and string, and this did not exist, then it wouldn't be able to hit this page. But because it does, it can't hit the page. This is good for our example. If that sounds confusing to you, don't worry about it. You're gonna see when we go into the test razor how this all works. So as you can see here, I'm gonna show you what happens when you have two of the exact same URLs on the page. This will actually cause it to break. Just gonna load it real quick. Boom. So you see that the page breaks because you have two of the exact same routes here, and it's not going to support that. So I'm just going to switch this back to what I wanted to do, my optional value. And now we're going to try to run it now. Now, you think it's going to work? Well, it runs the page, but let's try to actually, I mean, it runs the application, doesn't break on it. But let's actually try to get to the route example. Ooh, what happened here? I don't know if you can see this. As you can see down here, we have an unhandled exception. So what is happening here is that these parameters are not being represented on the page anywhere. So it's trying to look for values that don't exist, causing a runtime error. That's why it was able to load the page, but it wasn't able to actually run the page after the fact, after we had all this. But that's okay. All we have to do is start adding these parameters in code. So we have 3 parameters here, my optional bool, int, and the optional value. So I'm just gonna add stroke, public int ID get set. So make sure you spell them the same way you had them. And not only that, but we're gonna add a Blazor property here called parameter. So this is part of the component stuff, which I'll get into on the component video. But for now, just understand that you need to add these in order to reflect these parameters. That's how you work with the components. So we have 2 more to add. And instead of an int, we're gonna add a bool. And the bool is gonna be called whatever it is that you called it. I called it my optional bool. It's a bit of a misnomer, but that's fine. Know what it is. And then the last one is going to be my optional value, except it's a string. That, replace the bool with the string. So now we should be able to hit the page without breaking it. Boom. So now the pages work as expected, and we have the new URL values here that we could work with on this test razor page. So before we continue doing that, you know, it's really difficult to tell whether or not you're like, it's kind of annoying to tell whether you're actually running the right URLs, that you're not hitting one and not the other. So let's make it really easy for ourselves. And before we move on, we're gonna add a few, we're gonna actually just add what the parameters are being passed through. So if you see the parameter on the page, you'll see that this was a parameter that was being passed through from the other component. So we're gonna pass in the ID, and we're just gonna have the ID being reflected on the HTML. And we're gonna do the same thing for the other 3. Value. Oh, this is my optional bool, my bad. And the other one, my optional value one. So now we will clearly see what components get passed once we start doing the stuff on the test page. So right now we are done with the route example, and we're gonna hit the test page now in order to set up, you know, all the buttons that we need to set up. So before we move on, I would like you to add the question marks to each of these values. Oops. We're gonna make them nullable, because I want to see the value clearly on the page. So this will help us just look at the value to make sure that we're passing in what we are expecting to pass. And now for the test code. So all this is going to be are 3 buttons with inputs to pass in parameters in the URL to the route example page. And depending on, you know, whether it's a string, an int, or whatever, we're going to be doing different URL calls. Now, I'm going to show you 2 different ways One is just on the actual HTML itself through an href, aka the little links, and then one we're gonna do it through the code, which is gonna be the probably the most common way you're gonna be doing this if you build a Blazor specific project. So let's start with just an easy peasy one now that we have set up all our examples up here. Now, just in case, you only need this one to pass through in order to reach this page when it comes to the integer, because these are optional parameters. You do not need to pass these in, but you could, and it will still reach the page. That's the whole point. Let's begin adding our div here first. This div will house basically the button and the link for the first URL. Where we're gonna go add there, add a class, call this form control. Gonna make things look a little bit nicer. Not gonna be the nicest thing ever, but that. And for this ID, we're gonna put an input type. This type of number, obviously. And we have to add those 3 types to this code like we did over here. So in fact, we're just gonna go over here. I guess we don't. Copy these. Here. And we're just gonna remove these parameters here. We don't need them for this case. And these don't need to be null. Now we have our ID and the 3 different values we're going to be binding to the inputs. So in this case, we're just going to work with the how we do input, how we do this binding here. We bind the value to and now we're gonna want to change the value when we actually type in stuff. So we're gonna do bind value event is equal to on input. If you don't know what's happening here, this is just two-way binding, and if you need a refresher on that, I have a video right there, and you can check that out just after this tutorial. Now we have an input that goes with this ID, but now we need to submit it somehow. We could change the value all we want, but we haven't been able to submit it just yet. So in order to do that, we're gonna create an href link to show you the first way of how you can pass in values. This is a very simple link. I pass in href in here. Now you could use the component nav link if you want, but we're just gonna do it the way without the component for now. We don't really need it. The route example, and we're gonna pass in ID. And we're just gonna call this submit Now let's run it and see if we have any issues. Perfect. So as you can see, these are our values here. And if we go to test, we have a test of ID 0 and a submit ID of whatever we're going to pass in here. Pass in 2. So I submit that. It goes to the value, passes in number 22, and you see it on the page. Yeah, you could see it in the URL. This just makes it easier for me to present it to you guys watching this. That's why I told you to add all those paragraphs. So you have the first way of doing it, which is passing it directly into an href of some sort. But how do we do it with the string? This is another way of doing two-way binding of event handling, actually, because we're going to be using a function to do all this for us. In this case, we're going to be adding a button. So this is going to be a type of submit. And And this will have an event, an on-click event that we will create. Doesn't exist right now, but that's okay. We will preemptively here. And we're just going to call it route with ID. And then add the to it. So it's going to say that it's wrong because it doesn't exist. But we're going to be adding that now. Public void route with ID. Pass it in ID. So now here is where the tricky bit comes in when it comes to Blazor. In order for you to actually navigate between pages, you need something called the Navigation Manager. So where does this manager exist? Manager right now does not exist on this page, and you need to inject it into the. In order to do that, first you need to create a Navigation Manager object. Do so by this inject, and now we can do the public Navigation Manager. Call it gets this. Call this supposed to be capital I. Yep. So capital I inject public Navigation Manager here. This should give us the ability to get namespace for it, but if not, I'll tell you what to do. Go up to the top of the page, go at and now we're going to add the namespace, which is Microsoft.asp.NET Core dot extension, and you go with that. That should now have the Navigation Manager. So I cut that there to see because I was having an issue. But what you actually, once you have everything set up, the inject and the Microsoft ASP.NET Core extensions in on the page above, copy this down here. So this will kind of let IntelliSense know that you are, you know. Oh, this is because it's spelled differently. I put Navigation Manager with a lowercase m. This is capitalized M. I want to call it something a little bit different, but now you will see we have a bunch of these properties available to us. What we want is the navigate to property, and this is where we can start adding our URL. Now, you might be thinking right now that this is a lot of work in order to just navigate between pages. The issue comes when your application becomes really, really big, and that it's much easier to work with the code than it is to work with something like this href up here, because you're going to be constantly changing it on the HTML. Also, it's kind of bad practice to add a bunch of these values right on the page. Kind of want to be able to filter them somewhere in the server side, which this does. That's just best practices. So in this case, we're going to be adding our route example here. Spell it correctly. Slash. And then be adding another slash in the end. Plus ID. So we have our route with ID here as a button. Put it as code. Submit ID as an href. Let's run it, and hopefully everything I said works and there are no problems and no issues whatsoever. Right. Now we see that we have an ID field here. And now we see that we have our submit href and this. We know that the submit href works. What about that the code we just wrote? So let's try 33. Perfect. It does work. It's fairly simple. Once you have that navigation property ready to go, you can whatever you want with it and change it all you want within code, which makes it a lot more viable for you to use when your web application becomes more complex. And now that we have basically the base of it all, we can now continue to add other functions that will also reach the route example here. So we're gonna make 2 more functions that will mimic the URL that will have the URLs for this and this. Now that we have everything set up, it should be pretty easy. We're gonna just copy this, and instead of here, add a bool. We're gonna call it whatever we called it up here. I would just call it optional bool. You know, route with so the reason why I am doing it this way, so I want to show an example of this really good, a really decent example of this. So we're gonna do this in a very complicated way, just for me to drive this point home. Because we're setting up our text as 0 or above, we're going to set up our text as 0 or above. There's not going to be a null for it. So that's what we're going to use it as our separator. So what we're going to do is show you one of the reasons why we want to have, probably stick to use Navigation Manager as opposed to the href. You could do things like this. So let's say if IRID is more than 0, then we will also add our optional bool. And if our ID is more than 0, or in this case, it's gonna be or 0 or less, then we're just gonna send in Boolean value. That. So what's happening here is that if I have an ID that's more than 0, this is gonna be a default value, so it doesn't matter. I'm gonna come here, go find an ID of int, and then go get the optional URL. I'm gonna pass in these 2 values. So if I were to, if I have a value of above 0, we're gonna see this kick off, and we're gonna see both an ID and a bool. If my ID is 0 or less, we're just gonna see a Boolean get passed through, and it will work because we have a specific URL just for them. So now let's add the corresponding buttons that will do all that for us. Copy the original form control. Paste that. So in this case, we're just gonna have a number. We're gonna do. That's how you get a bool in. Of the ID, I have my optional value here. On input, that doesn't change. Also change. And we're gonna have to change, well, our new one, not with bool. Expect an ID. Gonna expect our. Hope not too far from the mic. Now we have this route with bool ready to go with this route example not ready to go. That. So now this will directly just hit the one URL here, the href, and this one depending on the ID value, will hit the one href or the other. All right, so let us check her out. Project up. It's not gonna be formatted pretty, but that's okay. So what I was explaining is that only this will submit one value. So if I press this button, you'll see that no other value was submitted, and you only see that the false was submitted because the checkbox, that hasn't been checked, it's false automatically. And in this case, I'm gonna add a number of 22, and we're gonna submit this. Expect to see both the ID and the Boolean value. That means it's hitting the correct URL. Now what happens when my ID is just 0 and I actually have something? Well, this was from the first example. So as you can see, there is no other parameter being sent up here. It's just true. So you can see that I'm actually changing the URL in the background, depending on what I want, and the page is accepting it. So although this might not look too crazy to you, this might be something important if you have more page navigations depending on parameters that you want to send through. If your application is more complex, if it needs this, that, and the other thing, this is how you would control it in the best way possible. And now we will introduce our final example, which is the string. So the string is a bit special in Boolean, in Blazor, where you don't actually have to call a type. So that's really the only difference. There's no like string type for it. If you look at the table of types that Blazor supports. So we're just gonna take the route with ID here and pass in the int ID string of whatever we have here, my optional value. Just there you go. And now we're gonna add my optional. Now we have a route with and we do the exact same thing. Take this string type is gonna be text. My optional value. Sorry about the naming convention. I kind of came up with them on the fly. My optional value, and in this case, because get a string value to be passed, you absolutely need an ID to get passed with it. Well, that's how we set it up. So in order to make that work, you need this here, route, expect to test there, pass in 6 string, test string, check out that button, 5, and boom. And now we have basically a full example of how to run routing in your Blazor project. So this might, when I first looked at it, I thought, I could just slap it onto another, video as an afterthought, but there's a lot that goes into paging and there's a lot that you can do with it and it's very flexible. And the best thing you want to do to run, your route, whatever your routing is going to be, is through the actual code because you have better control over it, and it's much safer because this will run on the server versus if you run it directly on the HTML like hrefs. And that's pretty much it. If you understood all of this, then you're pretty much ready to go to build your own web applications with many different pages, because you have essentially all the different ways you could use all the different tricks that Blazor has for paging, and you understand the fundamentals of paging. This is not the complete, it actually goes a lot deeper than this, but this is basically all you need to run a web application and, have it work out just fine. So I think that'll be it. This was a longer tutorial than I thought. I thought routing was a really easy thing, but apparently it's quite the rabbit hole, and I hope you enjoyed this video and my tutorial. So please let me know, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.